My name is Andrea, and I am 31 years old. I still remember that Christmas as if it's carved into my bones, the kind of memory that doesn't fade no matter how much time passes. Because at Christmas, my parents turned away my 10-year-old at the door, and nothing in my life was ever the same after that night. I wasn't there when it happened, and maybe that's what hurts the most, because if I had been, I would have stood in that doorway and blocked it with my own body. But instead, my little girl stood there alone, small hands clutching gift bags she had picked out herself, her heart so full of hope she didn't even think rejection was possible. She had to walk home alone carrying every gift she'd brought, and had to spend Christmas in an empty house. And every time I imagine her walking back through the cold with lights glowing in other people's windows, laughter leaking into the street, I feel like I failed her in the one moment that mattered most. That morning had started so normally. She had woken up before dawn, buzzing with excitement, whispering to herself as she wrapped the last present for her grandparents, carefully taping the edges because she wanted it to look perfect. She kept asking me if they would like the scarf she'd chosen for Grandma, if Grandpa would laugh at the silly mug she picked, and I told her yes because I truly believed they would, because I wanted to believe my parents were still capable of love when it counted. When we pulled up to their house, she jumped out of the car before I could even turn the engine off, practically running up the steps like Christmas itself was waiting behind that door. I stayed back for a moment, digging in my purse for my phone, smiling to myself, thinking how proud I was of her, thinking this was going to be one of those memories we'd talk about for years. I didn't hear the first words exchanged, but I saw the door open just enough for my mother's face to appear, tight and pale, her eyes flicking past my child as if she were something inconvenient left on the porch. My daughter's smile faltered, just a little, the way it does when a child senses something is wrong but hasn't accepted it yet. Then I heard the door close. Not slammed, not dramatic, just firmly shut like a decision already made. I called out confused, asking what was going on. But by the time I reached the steps, my daughter was already turning back toward the driveway, her shoulders hunched, her arms straining under the weight of the gifts she refused to put down. She didn't cry, not then, and that somehow made it worse, because she looked at me with this calm, wounded expression and said, "It's okay, Mom, they're busy." That lie broke something inside me. I knocked, I rang the bell. I raised my voice, but there was no answer. Just the muffled sounds of a television somewhere inside, like nothing had happened at all. People like to think cruelty comes with shouting and anger, but sometimes it comes quietly, in the choice to ignore a child standing in the cold. I drove her home in silence because I didn't trust myself to speak without falling apart. And when we stepped into our dark, undecorated house, the reality hit her all at once. She set the gifts down neatly by the door, as if she was still hoping someone would come to claim them, and asked if she could put the tree lights on even though we didn't have a tree. That was the moment I knew the damage was deeper than hurt feelings. It was a crack in her sense of belonging, a question forming in her mind about whether she deserved love at all. When I found out, I didn't shout. I took action. But not yet, not that day, because first I had to sit with her on the couch, wrap her in a blanket, and promise her that none of this was her fault, that adults sometimes make choices that have nothing to do with the worth of the child standing in front of them. Later that night, after she fell asleep clutching one of the gifts she'd meant to give away, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives asking why we hadn't come, casual words that made my hands shake with rage. I typed and deleted a dozen replies, knowing that whatever I said would change things forever. I stared at my parents' number for a long time, waiting for an apology that never came, waiting for a sign that they understood what they had done. 5 hours passed, the house silent except for the hum of the heater, and somewhere deep inside me a line was crossed. Because even though they didn't know it yet, 5 hours later their lives started to unravel, and the first thread was the quiet promise I made to my sleeping child that no one would ever make her feel unwanted again. Not on my watch, not ever. I didn't sleep that night, not really, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter standing on that porch again. And just before dawn, I made one phone call that changed everything. To the one person in our family who had always seen things clearly, my great-grandmother Eleanor, a woman so sharp and principled that even at 93, her voice could still slice, through lies like glass. I told her everything in one breath. About the door, the silence. How at Christmas, my parents turned away my 10-year-old at the door, and there was a pause on the line so long I wondered if the call had dropped, until she spoke in a voice so cold it made my skin prickle and said, "Give me their address, Andrea." By noon, she had already done what the rest of us had been too polite, too scared, or too conditioned to do for years, because my great-grandma called her lawyer. And she didn't do it for revenge, she did it for truth. You see, my parents had built their entire lives on an image, the perfect couple, generous, respectable, pillars of the community, but behind that image were contracts, properties, and a family trust that all technically belonged to Eleanor, set up decades earlier to protect future generations, with very clear clauses about conduct and responsibility. When Dadi Kaur, her lawyer, arrived at their house later that afternoon, my parents thought it was a mistake, some routine paperwork, until they read the words that detailed exactly how their choices had consequences. The lawyer explained calmly and professionally that Eleanor had decided to review the trust in light of recent behavior, specifically behavior involving the neglect and emotional harm of a minor family member. My mother tried to laugh it off, according to the lawyer, said it was all a misunderstanding, that children exaggerate, that Christmas was stressful, but Eleanor had already submitted a sworn statement describing what had happened, backed by my call logs, messages, and a time-stamped photo of my daughter's gifts sitting untouched by our door. Within an hour, access to accounts was frozen pending review. Authority over several properties was suspended, and suddenly the people who had shut a door on a child were scrambling to keep their own world from collapsing. Meanwhile, back at home, my daughter woke up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of music, and for the first time since the night before, she smiled without forcing it. I told her we were going to make our own Christmas, our own rules, and we spent the day building a blanket fort, watching movies, and opening the gifts she had been so carefully carrying. Gifts she decided to keep or donate herself, because I wanted her to feel in control again. In the evening, Eleanor called me back and asked to speak to my daughter directly, telling her how proud she was of her courage and kindness, and promising that no one who treated her that way would ever get to decide her worth again. Over the next few days, the fallout spread quietly but thoroughly, because reputation is fragile when it's built on pretense. My parents' friends started asking questions, board members grew distant, and invitations stopped coming, not because anyone knew every detail, but because uncertainty makes people nervous. When my parents finally called me, their voices were sharp with panic instead of authority, demanding to know what I had done, and I told them the truth that when I found out, I didn't shout, I took action. And that action came from a place they had underestimated for years, the resolve of a mother and the backbone of a woman who had survived far worse than their disapproval. They asked to see my daughter, to explain, to fix things. But I said no, because apologies made under pressure aren't apologies. They're negotiations, and my child wasn't a bargaining chip. Eleanor finalized the trust changes a week later, redirecting funds toward education accounts and charitable foundations focused on child welfare, making it clear that legacy meant protecting the vulnerable, not rewarding cruelty. On Christmas night, exactly 1 year later, my daughter and I stood in a house filled with laughter, friends and chosen family, and she looked up at me and said she wasn't scared of doors anymore because she knew there would always be someone on her side. That was the moment I understood that the real unraveling wasn't financial or social. It was moral, because people who can turn away a child at the door lose something essential, and once it's gone, no amount of money or status can replace it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that actions matter and protecting children is never optional, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because stories like this deserve to be heard, remembered, and turned into strength.